But those votes, those 40,000 votes, there has to be court action to ensure that those people who are mostly Republican voters get their votes counted, Mr. Speaker.
They must reject voter applications from any individuals who've never lived in North Carolina. Man, it's getting very sneaky out there.
Kamala Harris better hope that's the case, because otherwise this right track, wrong direction situation will not work out in their favor.
Hurricane Helene and the impacts on the 2024 election are now being contemplated, and we've been talking about this for a long time, zooming in on the various counties that have been receiving federal aid and why certain things are being slow rolled. Obviously, when you have a hurricane, we have questions about turnout. Feels like that might be a pretty big suppressive event, and if the rural areas got obliterated and the cities, which tend to be blue, didn't, then the rural red areas will be suppressed and the other areas will not be suppressed. Axelrod is talking about it. Now even Politico is admitting it, saying Helene hit Trump strongholds in both Georgia and North Carolina, and it could swing the election. And I felt gross talking about elections and politics when people were underwater, and we acknowledged that when we were talking about it, but we know what they were thinking, and we know that they never let a crisis go to waste, and they admitted that. And we talked about the North Carolina law and the exceptions in the rules that allow people to vote with an affidavit and no ID, confirmed by the statutes. And now Republicans are also filing a lawsuit here going after the UOCAVA ballots, which we already saw in Pennsylvania got a very curious directive that allowed them to basically not check the UOCAVA overseas military ballots. This is brought by the RNC against the election folks in North Carolina. And so this is happening simultaneously with the hurricane relief. But here's what Politico is reporting for us, saying officials in both swing states are now facing urgent decisions about helping people vote in these shattered communities. And it's not good, right? Research has shown that major disasters can influence voter turnout and preference. And Helene has pushed this contest into new novel territory. It's the first catastrophic event in U.S. history to hit two critical swing states within 6 weeks of a presidential election, based on Politico's analysis. Now, parts of western North Carolina and eastern Georgia that were flooded are largely Republican. And we talked about this yesterday, looking at the actual spreadsheets. In 2022, he won 61% of the vote in North Carolina counties that declared a disaster. He won 54% of the vote in Georgia's disaster counties. Both Trump and Kamala this week visited Georgia, a state that Biden won by just 11,000 votes. They both have 16 electoral votes. Trump is leading by like 1 percentage point in both states, well within the margin of error. There's going to be a lot of voting alterations, said the director, and it's probably going to affect turnout, said the director. Now both states face crucial decisions in the next few days about whether to extend the voting registration deadlines, grant more time for voters to cast absentee ballots, and set up new polling places in areas where floods destroyed roads. State records show that nearly 40,000 absentee ballots were mailed in counties that declared a disaster following Helene. Fewer than 1,000 have been returned. Same thing's happening in Georgia. Until we get out there to assess what's going on, we don't really know. Now, Helene hit some predominantly Democratic communities hard too, adding to the uncertainty. In North Carolina, for example, Macomb County was affected in really bad ways, and that's a liberal bastion, they said. That was the one county that we saw that actually had more Democratic turnout than Republican, or registrations rather. Overall, Helene, they said, could dramatically change who is in the electorate. Isn't that convenient? In a state like North Carolina where margins matter, every little tweak to the electorate could be a tweak that makes the difference. And this is the point that we've been making here, like a broken record, saying that they're just changing things around the margins. Literally, they just say, well, we'll just accept some of those additional UOCAVA ballots, and we'll just do this over here and just turn that knob a little bit, a little bit, a little bit. Change the manuals. They don't have to change the laws. They just have to change how they count the votes according to the law, because the laws aren't that specific. Now, county election offices in North Carolina, 5 of which remain closed, are going to assess damage. Legislature in North Carolina meets on Wednesday. Could have some emergency polling places and more. Georgia, Monday is the last day to register to vote. Past disasters, they've just simply extended deadlines and so on. But such states have varied results according to studies. 2022 study by Morris found that voter turnout fell below historical averages in the Republican panhandle of Florida after Hurricane Michael in 2018. So it matters. It's going to continue to matter. Sandy, they did some other analysis of this. Decisions by New Jersey officials to keep voting accessible also proved to be more controversial, right? What do? You just set up little ballot drop box. It's not good at all. So we've got Kevin McCarthy, who's also out here talking about this, saying this is not going to be good. Says that Hurricane Helene could lose Trump the 2024 election. He asks why no one is doing anything to protect the western North Carolina votes. Here's Kev.
We've been documenting that since Monday night, and and I got a lot of blowback saying, oh, you're politicizing it. No, I was hearing from people who went to school with me, who are there. So that's what I was hearing. And these are not political people. I don't even think they like Trump, by the way. But going back to this voting issue, because I think this is very important. Obviously, loss of life could be the worst hurricane we've ever had in this country. But those votes, those 40,000 votes, there has to be court action to ensure that those people who are mostly Republican voters get their votes counted, Mr. Speaker.
Why this is so important, 20,000 votes determined who won Wisconsin. And if President Trump doesn't win North Carolina, he can't win the presidency.
Right.
So why aren't we ensuring that these votes? Is the ballot still there? Do they make sure they're able to mail them in? This really comes down to three major states, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and North Carolina. And you look at the tragedy that happened in North Carolina and Georgia. We need to make sure that they have the ability to vote, that those votes are counted, and those votes are protected.
Yeah, and so protected votes is another big issue. So Republicans are now suing to get some clarity on this. And so the North Carolina State Board of Elections is being sued. This is from the RNC. They are now suing, and it's over the UOCAVA stuff. And so let's see what is happening in here. Now, before we get into this amazing filing, we have to ask ourselves, whatever happened to that legendary man called Chuck Norris? I recently saw a video he made, and I was shocked. He's in his 80s, and he's still kicking butt. He's working out and staying active. And what's even more shocking is he's stronger, he can work out longer, and he even has plenty of energy left over for his grandkids. And he did this by making just one change. He says he still feels like he's in his 50s. His wife even started doing this one thing too, and she's never felt better either. She says she feels 10 years younger, her body looks leaner, and she has energy all day. And Chuck made a special video that explains everything. And you can go watch it right now by going to chuckdefense.com/RG, or you can click the link in the description below this video. It's going to change the way you think about your health. Once again, chuckdefense.com/RG. Click the link in the description. You're not going to believe how simple it is. It's Chuck Norris, legendary. 84 years old, more energy than me. He discovered he could create dramatic changes to his health simply by focusing on three things that sabotage our bodies as we age. And so click the link down in the description below, chuckdefense.com/RG, and let's get back into it. The lawsuit is happening, and the challenge is that the North Carolina Constitution, of course, limits who can vote. So if you're in North Carolina and you're a resident, you got the right to vote. That's according to the Constitution, and it's been explained and codified in these cases. Now, then Congress enacted UOCAVA. Now, we're familiar with this. We see the same shenanigans happening in Pennsylvania and other locations. Here, they're referencing the federal law once again. Now, despite the state constitution's unambiguous requirement of residency as a pre-qualification to vote, so you have to be a resident. You can't just vote in the elections if you don't live there. Okay, that makes sense. And North Carolina's extension of the UOCAVA, which is their version of the federal law, it says it purports to extend voter qualifications to certain individuals not covered by UOCAVA who do not and have not resided in North Carolina, right? So there's a different statute, UMOVA North Carolina statute. It defines a covered voter as a person entitled to all the things, including people who never actually resided in North Carolina. Indeed, these overseas covered voters may never have resided anywhere in the United States, let alone North Carolina. And so this is a group of voters that falls outside the scope of UOCAVA. So we've got federal law, then we've got the implementation of the federal law via state statute, and the state statute seemingly is opposed directly to two things: federal law, which defers to the state, and the state saying you have to be a resident pursuant to the state constitution in order to be able to vote in the state election. So as a result, under UMOVA, which we're going to say is the state implementation, and let's just confirm that, North Carolina's, right, uniform military, UMOVA is the state. So UMOVA, under that, certain people that are not covered by UOCAVA because they have to be residents who have never resided in North Carolina are registering to vote, and they're voting in all its elections, including local, state, and federal contests, state ballot measures, and more. So people who've never resided in North Carolina are voting in North Carolina elections. Now, this is not only a violation of the North Carolina Constitution, but as applied, it dilutes our votes and harms our missions, right, as the people filing this lawsuit at the RNC. Now, further, North Carolina Carolina election officials have unlawfully treated UMOVA voters as if they were UCAVA voters, including by exempting them from voter ID requirements that apply to first-time voters. Only UCAVA voters, not the UMOVA voters, are entitled to exemption for those requirements. And so accordingly, North Carolina officials, by using this exploit, have registered to vote people who have never resided in North Carolina and have allowed them to vote in North Carolina's state and federal elections without taking the steps to verify their ID. This not only exposes our elections to substantial risk of fraud and other misconduct, but it's contrary to state law, right? Another external ballot problem. And they're using the laws that they pass to create rules to not check ID. So we know who the parties are. This guy's a resident. RNC's involved in this. Their mission is lawful votes. The North Carolina Republican Party's involved. North Carolina GOP's involved, all trying to get to the bottom of these failures. They all have standing because they're directly impacted by this and more. Now, the court hears the following factual allegations. They say, now for presidential elections, the state constitution allows the General Assembly to reduce the time of the residency requirements. You can live there for 1 month, 6 months, 10 months, 1 year, 5 years, whatever. But it does not allow for the alteration of the prerequisite of actual residency, right? You have to declare residency there and have it, establish it. But UMOVA, the state implementation of this, Article 21 of North Carolina statutes, it sets forth certain conditions upon which non-resident uniformed and overseas voters may register and vote in North Carolina. So they passed a state law and it defines a covered voter within the scope of the statute. A uniformed service voter or an overseas voter who is registered to vote in this state, right? So that would mean, okay, you registered, your ID's checked, you're verified, confirmed. UMOVA includes that, right, under the law. It also includes an overseas voter who before leaving the United States was last eligible to vote in this state and except for a state residency requirement, otherwise satisfies the voter eligibility requirement. So wait, what? Is that in violation of the Constitution? Where did they get the ability to write that exception in there? Or actually, this is the law, right? So let's see. An overseas voter who before leaving the United States, so it seems like that might be in conflict with the Constitution, which if it's a statute would be superseded by the Constitution of North Carolina. An overseas voter who before leaving the United States would have been eligible to vote except for the residency requirement, otherwise satisfies the eligibility requirements, and more. Now, critically under this, the definition of a covered voter encompasses certain persons who have never been residents of North Carolina, provided that their parent or legal guardian would have been eligible to vote before they left the country. Now, for clarity, this means that the North Carolina law extends the right to register to vote and to vote in the elections to persons who have never lived in the United States, let alone in North Carolina, under the law. Now, UMOVA could also be read to extend those rights to certain persons living overseas who may have at one time lived in a state other than North Carolina, provided they did not ever register to vote in that state, depending on their parents. Now, the fact that this subsection allows non-residents to vote in North Carolina is buttressed by other definitions in the same section, including subsection C, which covers persons who were eligible to vote in North Carolina before they left, D, which covers persons who would have been eligible to vote if they didn't have the voting age requirement. But simply put, this law purports to allow certain persons who never lived in North Carolina, resided in, or potentially never even set foot in the state to register and to vote in all the elections. Now, federal law partially preempts the residency requirement for some, but not all of the overseas issues. Although the federal law may preempt the residency requirement in certain federal elections, so the federal statute overrides the North Carolina Constitution, it does not preempt the requirement for voters who never resided in the state. So residency at some point. So maybe it's not a residency requirement currently, but we're talking historically speaking. Did you ever reside? In short, those voters who are not UOCAVA voters, nor are they within the scope, and so they shouldn't count. And look at this. On its terms, the law would appear to even extend to people who have absolutely no connection to North Carolina at all. For example, a person whose parents gave birth to him after they left the United States from Florida, who returned to North Carolina without the child after he turned 18, and who thereafter then left the United States again. Okay, so there's like these weird permutations. And I can basically guarantee you that nobody's checking that. So absent uniformed services voters means the following. And so in both form and function, it only extends voter eligibility to voters who are temporarily away from the state, at least been domiciled in the state at some point. Now, the defendant members are responsible for actually implementing the North Carolina rules. Are they checking all those permutations or not? This imposes various responsibilities on them to administer this. It also allows them to delegate some of this stuff to the board, including the requirement to make records available. Notably, both these forms require voters to affirm the following, right? When you sign up to register to vote in North Carolina, I am a U.S. citizen living outside the country, and I have never lived in the United States. Now, upon information and belief, if the applicant selected this option on the form, North Carolina would accept that and process the application, right? Somebody says, I'm a U.S. citizen living abroad, and I've never lived in the United States, meaning if they check that, that counts. The website, the FAQ, confirms this. If you go to the North Carolina website, North Carolina allows citizens who have never resided in the United States to use a parent's voting residence as their own to register to vote and may request military and overseas absentee ballots. Defendants are thus facilitating ongoing violations of the Constitution by carrying this out that allows unqualified non-residents to vote in violation of the North Carolina Constitution. And they're also using UMOVA to require ID from persons who are registering to vote, right? So that's the other side. Now, their failure to require this ID threatens the integrity. So there is an excuse, right? The law kind of allows for it in a way, but you've got to provide some ID so that we can see if you fit into the requirements, but then they're not actually getting the ID, and it threatens the state's elections. Now, there's HAVA, right? It requires individuals registering to vote to provide ID, including a driver's license. Voters who have neither are exempt from this requirement, right? Provide your driver's license, provide your social security. If you don't have either, then you don't need to provide something. North Carolina has enacted a statute to help with that. HAVA at the state level further provides for a process to match the ID. North Carolina matched that. It requires first-time voters who register by mail, either those whose ID numbers could not be verified or whatever, to provide ID and a copy of that ID when they return their ballot. It's called the HAVA ID requirement. Now, HAVA does not exempt UOCAVA voters from this requirement. It does, however, exempt UOCAVA voters from the HAVA ID requirement. So HAVA then requires states to treat an absentee ballot from a voter subject to the HAVA ID requirement. They cast it as a provisional ballot. Then they defer to state law as to whether to count the ballot. So there's a lot of layers to this. Then North Carolina has enacted the same statutes. So then on September 24th, the North Carolina board, the elections board, it transmitted this new guidance, right? The new directives. This is where they get sneaky with all this. They know what the rules are, and then they explain the exemptions. A copy has been attached. Now, the guidance explained correctly the state and federal legal requirements that individuals who register to vote through this form must provide a driver's license number or the last four digits, and that county officials are required to attempt to match that with official databases, right? So that's good. Okay, nailed it. Now, the guidance also stated, unlike civilian voters, North Carolina law expressly exempts UOCAVA voters from the requirement to provide HAVA ID if the number fails to match across the databases. So you should try to match it, but if it doesn't match, they don't need to match. The guidance conflates UOCAVA voters and the UMOVA voters, despite the latter not being UOCAVA voters, right? So they're getting the buckets wrong. Now, the guidance states, quote, I'm writing to clarify the requirement for ID numbers for new registrants who register via one of these forms. In fact, on August 25th, Brinson Bell emailed a member of the Henderson County Board of Elections and blind carbon copy the board members, and they attached the email. The email states, so these are the directives going out from the election people. When a military or overseas citizen's voter submits their ballot, neither federal law nor state law requires them to provide ID when returning their ballot. Look at that. That's their email, and that's in example B. Now, the email fails to make any distinction between the UOCAVA voters and the HAVA, and the guidance and email makes abundantly clear that they are disregarding the requirements of the law, which exempts from its HAVA ID only individuals that are entitled to vote by absentee ballot under UOCAVA, right? So it's a confusing complaint because of all the acronyms. This would be something you don't want to diagram out on a whiteboard. But defendants must immediately cease their violations, stop telling them that they can not check things, stop them from utilizing the law in this manner. They must immediately instruct county boards not to process and segregate ballots returned by individuals who never resided in the state. They must be removed. Remove the box from the online application saying that they can vote. They must reject voter applications from any individuals who've never lived in North Carolina. Man, it's getting very sneaky out there. Defendants must notify about people who are ineligible to vote, and we know that they're going to be fighting this tooth and nail. So issue a declaratory judgment stopping all of this, filed by the RNC, and Philip J. Strzok is the lawyer behind that. Here CNN is talking about some of the numbers.
That Julia and Sarah were just talking about exploding expectations, way over expectations. Unemployment low at 4.1%, dropping. Seems to say the economy is in a good place. One of the numbers, Harry Etten, senior data reporter Harry Etten is here. One of the numbers we always talk about in elections is, do voters think the country is on the right track or the wrong track? What do the polls show?
Yeah, if we look at whether voters believe we're on the right track or the wrong track, I think that this sort of gets at a problem for Kamala Harris's campaign. Just 28% of Americans think the U.S. is on the right track. And I want you to put that into perspective, right? When does the average, when the incumbent party loses the election, look at that. It's just 25%. That looks a heck of a lot like that 28%, right, that currently think the country is on the right track. When the White House party wins, i.e. Kamala Harris's party, the Democrats, 42% on average think that the country is on the right track. This 25% looks a lot more like this 28%. It doesn't look anything like this 42%. This, to me, is a bad sign for Kamala Harris's campaign. It looks a lot more like a loser than it does like a winner when it comes to the country being on the right track.
Can an incumbent party win with numbers like this?
Yeah, so if we look historically speaking, right, and we say, okay, say the U.S. is on the right track, the incumbent party, when they win. Today, again, it's just 28%.
Weird
Look
video
throughout
recording.
History, right, 96, 88, 04, 12, 84. In all these instances, far more than 28% thought that the country was on the right track. 39 was the lowest back in 1996. We got upwards of 47% in 84. Of course, that was a blowout, right, for Ronald Reagan. So there is no historical precedent for the White House party winning another term in the White House when the 28% of the country thinks that we're on the right track.
Yeah, but
John,
they'll have a bunch
simply
of
put, it
printed
would be
ballots that they'll
historically
just shove in
unprecedented.
So
everybody's
is there any good
boxes.
news or interpretation or prism you can look through where Democrats can say, well, maybe it's okay?
Let's look back to the last midterm, because sometimes history is made to be broken. All right, say the country is on the right track in midterms. Democrats had a good midterm despite this. The old low for the country saying that we were on the right track was 27% back in 1994. Of course, that was a blowout, right? The Republicans romped over the Democrats and Bill Clinton. But this particular past midterm, look, just 26% said that the country was on the right track, and Democrats did pretty gosh darn good. Maybe we've entered a new political environment where Donald Trump is so unpopular that these historical norms, these historical measures that we look at don't actually mean what we think anymore. I'll tell you this much. Kamala Harris better hope that's the case, because otherwise this right track, wrong direction situation will not work out in their favor.
The other thing Democrats do say is numbers like the jobs numbers we just saw, they are seeing things improve a little bit week by week on the margins.
Yeah, I would say, look, right now, if we're saying, 28% of the country is on the right track, that number was closer to low 20s at the beginning of the year. So it has gone up a little bit, but still, you're very much in the danger zone when we're looking at that right track, wrong direction number. That's where Democrats are right now. They're going to have to hope that there's a historical norm broken like there was in the past midterm, because if there isn't, Donald Trump's going to end up in the White House.
I will tell you, no one except for Tom Cruise in Top Gun likes being in the danger zone.
All right, so numbers are not looking good for them, and we saw a similar pattern of that in 2020, but for some reason, Joe Biden still got historic votes, in our opinion, because they cheated. Now, here was Trump out in Georgia, hanging out with Brian Kemp. Some of those swing states are going to matter. The performance of the incumbent party, of course, is going to matter. Trump is out there with a governor that they used to not have a warm relationship. Now they are seemingly friends.
35% of our cotton crop is a total loss. 10 to 30% of the peanut crop is lost. 14 dairies across the state are still without power. There was 22 total from the start. Over 222 poultry houses have been destroyed, with hundreds of others damaged and some loss of operations for the entire farm. There's extensive infrastructure damage and loss of livestock facilities. And as I told the president earlier, approximately 4 million acres of timberland has been impacted, and 48,000 acres of pecans have been damaged or destroyed as a result of this storm. I want everyone in this state to know that we are with you during these difficult times, and we aren't going anywhere. We are putting every possible state resource we have at response and recovery, and I've taken several executive authority steps to try to bring relief as quickly as we can. That includes activating and deploying roughly 2,000 Georgia Guardsmen, our citizen soldiers who are doing incredible work in the field. It includes suspending the gas tax for as long as we're under a state of emergency and waiving the penalty on the use of dyed diesel fuel in street vehicles.
All right, so the response continues, and Trump is there.